There were no reporters outside the building, no fans waiting, no headlines ready to be written, just a doctor's office, and a voice that changed mid-sentence. That was the day Elvis Presley realized something was wrong, not because of what the doctor said, but because of how he said it. Stay with us until the end, because this story reveals a moment Elvis faced a fear louder than any crowd, the moment his body stopped being something he could ignore. The room smelled like antiseptic and paper. Elvis noticed at first how clean everything felt, how neutral, the kind of place designed to keep emotion out. He sat on the edge of the chair, hands resting loosely on his thighs, posture calm enough to look convincing. He had done this before. Doctors' offices weren't new. Neither were concerns. Years of touring had taught him to expect discomfort, fatigue, strange symptoms that came and went without explanation. Most of the time, they passed. This visit was supposed to be routine. The doctor stood across from him, flipping through papers, eyes moving quickly, efficiently. Elvis watched him the way he watched crowds sometimes, not listening yet, just observing. The doctor cleared his throat. "All right," he said, "let's talk for a moment." The tone was casual. Too casual. Elvis nodded once, his expression neutral, waiting. He had learned long ago that reacting too quickly invited unnecessary attention. The doctor began explaining numbers, measurements, normal ranges. Elvis followed along easily, recognizing the rhythm. This was the safe part, the technical part, the part that made everything feel manageable. Then the doctor paused. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't long, just long enough. He glanced down at the papers again, then back up at Elvis. His voice lowered slightly when he spoke again. "And this here," he said, tapping a line with his finger, "this is what I want to discuss." Something tightened in Elvis's chest. Not fear yet, recognition. The doctor's voice had changed. Not in volume, in intention. Elvis leaned back slightly in the chair, crossing his arms loosely, a habit he didn't consciously register. He watched the doctor's face now, not the papers. "What about it?" Elvis asked. The doctor chose his words carefully. "That's not something we should ignore." There it was. Not the diagnosis. Not the warning. The shift. Elvis felt the room narrow around him. Not physically, but emotionally. The edges felt closer, sharper. "How long has that been happening?" the doctor asked. Elvis answered automatically. "Weeks. Maybe longer." It was hard to say. He'd learned to measure time by shows, not days. The doctor nodded slowly, the way people do when they're assembling a picture they don't fully like. "I see," he said quietly. That was when Elvis felt it, a subtle drop in his stomach, like missing a step you didn't know was there. The doctor leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. He didn't rush. He didn't soften his posture either. "I want to run a few more tests," he said, "just to be sure. Just to be sure." The phrase landed heavier than it should have. Elvis nodded again, his face composed, his voice steady. "All right." Inside, something shifted, because Elvis understood something in that moment that no one had prepared him for. This wasn't about stamina, or scheduling, or pushing through. This was about his body becoming a variable he could no longer fully control. The doctor continued speaking, outlining next steps, precautions, things to watch for. Elvis listened carefully, absorbing every word, every pause. But one thought echoed louder than the rest. "My body is talking, and I haven't been listening." When the appointment ended, Elvis stood, thanked the doctor, shook his hand. Everything looked normal from the outside. As he walked toward the door, the doctor added one final sentence. "Don't wait on this." Elvis stopped for half a second, then nodded. "I won't," he said. But as he stepped out into the hallway, the weight of the visit settled fully into his chest. The doctor's voice hadn't changed because of fear. It had changed because of certainty. And Elvis knew, before any results came back, that this day would not fade quietly into the background like so many others. Something had begun. The hallway felt longer than it should have. Elvis walked slowly, his footsteps muted by the carpet, the quiet hum of the building wrapping around him like a thin layer of fog. He had left the doctor's office behind, but the shift in that voice hadn't stayed there. It walked with him. The elevator doors opened, and Elvis stepped inside alone. As they closed, his reflection appeared faintly in the polished metal walls. He avoided looking at it, fixing his eyes instead on the glowing numbers as they descended. Routine, he told himself. Just routine. But the word didn't settle the way it usually did. Outside, the air was brighter, louder, more ordinary. Cars passed. People talked. Life moved forward without acknowledging the moment that had just quietly split his day in two. Elvis slid into the backseat of the car and closed the door. The familiar interior should have comforted him. Instead, it felt smaller, tighter, as if the space had shrunk around him. "Everything all right?" the driver asked casually. "Yeah," Elvis replied without hesitation. The lie came easily. The car pulled away, merging into traffic. Elvis leaned his head back and closed his eyes, letting the movement carry him while his thoughts refused to slow. The doctor hadn't said anything definitive. No diagnosis. No final words. And yet, the fear was already fully formed. That was what surprised him most. He had always believed fear arrived with information, with bad news, with certainty. This was different. This fear had arrived with implication, with tone, with the awareness that something wasn't being said out loud yet. Elvis pressed his fingers together, grounding himself in the sensation. His body felt the same. No pain, no immediate warning signs demanding attention. That almost made it worse, because it meant the danger, whatever it was, lived beneath the surface. He thought about how often he had ignored his body in the past. How many nights he'd pushed through exhaustion, convincing himself that discomfort was just part of the job. He'd been praised for it, admired for it. Strength, he'd learned, was continuing anyway. Now, that lesson felt incomplete. The car stopped at a light, and Elvis opened his eyes. A man crossed the street, pushing a stroller. A woman laughed into a phone. None of them knew where he'd just been. None of them needed to. For the first time, Elvis felt acutely aware of how private fear could be. This wasn't something applause could drown out. It wasn't something performance could distract him from. This was his body, the one thing he couldn't replace, delegate or outpace. He realized then that the fear wasn't loud or frantic. It was focused. It pointed inward. Elvis thought about the next few days. The shows already scheduled. The commitments already made. The people who would assume everything was fine because he would make it look that way. The idea of canceling didn't even fully form. Not yet. What formed instead was a question he'd never seriously entertained before. What happens if I can't push through this? The car turned into a familiar driveway, tires crunching softly. Elvis didn't move right away when it stopped. He stayed seated, one hand resting on the door handle, feeling the weight of the question settle deeper. He had spent his life building something that depended on his availability, his voice, his presence, his ability to endure. And now, a single change in the doctor's voice had introduced the possibility that endurance might no longer be guaranteed. Elvis stepped out of the car and into the quiet of the house. The door closed behind him, sealing off the outside world. Inside, the silence felt heavier than usual. He stood there for a moment, unmoving. This fear wasn't about dying. Not yet. It was about losing control over the one thing he'd always trusted, his body's willingness to obey. Elvis understood then that whatever the test revealed, this day had already changed him. Because once you hear uncertainty in a doctor's voice, you never hear your own body the same way again. And as he walked deeper into the house, Elvis realized something unsettling and unavoidable. The appointment hadn't ended when he left the office. It had only changed locations. The waiting had begun. The house felt unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because Elvis had. He moved through the room slowly, not out of fatigue, but out of attention. Every step, every breath, every subtle sensation seemed suddenly louder, as if his body had decided to speak all at once after years of being ignored. He sat down, then stood up again, too restless to settle, too alert to relax. Elvis realized how rarely he had truly listened to himself without filtering everything through obligation. Pain had always been measured by whether it interfered with performance. Fatigue mattered only if it affected his voice. Everything else was background noise. Until now, he placed a hand flat against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his palm. It was normal, strong, reassuring, and yet fragile. That contradiction unsettled him. Elvis thought back to the doctor's pause, the lowered tone, the careful choice of words. Doctors didn't speak that way unless something sat just outside certainty, something that needed confirmation, but demanded respect immediately. He poured a glass of water and drank slowly, noticing how deliberate the act felt. He had rushed through meals, skipped rest, overridden warning signs so many times that slowing down now felt almost unnatural. For the first time, Elvis wondered how many signals he had dismissed simply because they didn't fit into his life. There had been moments. Shortness of breath he blamed on long nights. Dizziness he attributed to travel. A tightness he explained away as stress. Each one, individually harmless. Together, possibly not. Elvis sat at the table and rested his elbows against the surface, staring at the grain of the wood. He felt a quiet anger rise, not at the doctor, not at the situation, but at himself. He had treated his body like a tool, reliable, replaceable, something to be pushed until it responded. That strategy had worked for years, until it didn't. The fear that followed wasn't dramatic. It didn't spiral into panic or denial. It became focused, almost disciplined, a mirror of the way he'd lived his life. If something was wrong, he wanted to know. If something needed to change, he needed time. What terrified him wasn't the possibility of illness. It was a possibility that his body had been asking for attention long before now. And he hadn't been listening. Elvis leaned back and closed his eyes, letting his awareness move inward. He noticed the way his shoulders stayed tense even when he wasn't moving, the way his jaw tightened without thought, the way his breathing remained shallow, conditioned by years of performing under pressure. This wasn't sudden. It was cumulative. The realization settled heavily. If the test confirmed what the doctor suspected, this wouldn't be a battle he could outwork. There would be no pushing through, no shortcuts. His body would set the terms. And that frightened him more than any diagnosis. Because Elvis had built a life around control, of sound, of timing, of image. Control had been his protection, his armor. Illness ignored control. It demanded surrender. He stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the quiet stretch of street beyond. Everything looked the same. Ordinary. Safe. Inside him, something fundamental had shifted. Elvis understood then that this moment wasn't about fear of an ending. It was about fear of reckoning. Reckoning with how much he had asked of himself. How little he had given back. The doctor's voice echoed again in his mind. Don't wait on this. Elvis nodded to himself, the gesture small but resolute. He wouldn't. Whatever came next, he would meet it awake. For the rest of the afternoon, Elvis stayed quiet. He canceled nothing, announced nothing. He simply listened to his body, to the silence, to the unease that refused to be drowned out. The waiting continued, but it was no longer passive. It had become deliberate. And as the light shifted toward evening, Elvis knew that when the doctor finally spoke again, with answers instead of pauses, he wouldn't be hearing them as the man he'd been that morning. He would be hearing them as someone who finally understood that survival wasn't about endurance. It was about attention. And that lesson, once learned, could never be unlearned. Evenings settled slowly, stretching the hours instead of closing them. Elvis noticed how time behaved differently now. Minutes felt heavier, more deliberate, as if each one expected something from him. He moved through the house with care, turning lights on and off without really registering why. Opening doors he didn't step through. He was waiting. Not for answers, not yet. For confirmation. The phone sat where it always did, silent and ordinary. Elvis found himself glancing at it more often than he cared to admit. Every time it didn't ring, his chest tightened slightly, then loosened again, relief and dread sharing the same space. He tried to distract himself. Picked up a book, put it down, turned on the television, muted it within seconds. Sound felt intrusive now, like it would break something fragile he was trying to hold together. So he let the silence stay. As night deepened, Elvis realized how unfamiliar it was for him to be waiting for someone else's words to determine his next move. His life had been built on momentum. If something stood in the way, he pushed. If something slowed him down, he went around it. This was different. This required stillness. The absence of the call became its own presence. Each hour without it sharpened the awareness that whatever the doctor had seen was significant enough to need confirmation, careful enough to require caution. Elvis thought about the doctor's final look. The way his eyes had lingered just a moment too long. The way reassurance hadn't been offered automatically. That look stayed with him. He sat down at the table and rested his forearms against the surface, fingers interlaced, though it felt cool beneath his skin. Solid, reliable, his body didn't. That realization brought with a new layer of fear. Not sudden, not sharp, but steady. What if the answers didn't come quickly? What if the waiting itself became the test? Elvis had always feared breakdowns that arrived dramatically. Collapses, moments you couldn't hide. This felt worse. This was quiet erosion. He stood and walked a mirror, stopping a few feet away. He didn't study himself this time. He simply acknowledged a reflection, a man who looked exactly as expected, carrying a question no one else could see. How long? He asked softly, not expecting an answer. The question wasn't about life. It was about this version of himself that relied on denial, that mistook silence for safety. Elvis realized then that if the call came tomorrow, or the next day, or later still, the damage wasn't in the waiting. It was in what waiting revealed. He had built a life where stopping felt dangerous, where rest felt irresponsible, where attention to himself always came second to what was demanded. That structure had left him unprepared for a moment that required patience instead of action. The phone remained silent. Elvis poured himself a drink and didn't finish it. He stared at the glass, watching the liquid settle again and again as his hand shifted slightly. This wasn't fear of death. It was fear of vulnerability, of being forced into honesty, not with the public, not with the world, but with himself. If something was wrong, it would mean change, not temporary adjustments, but fundamental ones, boundaries, limits, decisions he had avoided because they threatened momentum. Elvis had never been afraid of effort. He had been afraid of stopping. As midnight approached, he sat in the darkened living room, lights off now, the outline of furniture barely visible. The house felt larger in the dark, emptier, as if space itself were waiting with him. The call didn't come. And somewhere in that absence, Elvis understood something crucial. If the doctor never called again, he would still never hear his body the same way. The uncertainty had already done its work. He stood and went to bed, not expecting sleep. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling, he placed one hand over his chest again, feeling the rhythm beneath it. Steady. For now. The waiting continued. But it no longer felt like paralysis. It felt like a threshold. And Elvis knew that when the phone finally rang, whenever it did, it wouldn't just be bringing information. It would be asking him whether he was ready to live differently. That question, he realized, had already been answered. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. The phone rang just after sunrise. Not loud, not urgent, but sharp enough to cut through everything. Elvis had been awake already, staring at the ceiling, counting nothing in particular. When the sound came, his body reacted before his mind did, shoulders tensing, breath catching halfway in. He didn't move right away. For a moment, he let it ring, as if delaying the sound might delay the meaning attached to it. Then he reached out and picked up the receiver. "Hello." The doctor's voice was calm. Too calm. That was how Elvis knew this wasn't routine anymore. They exchanged a few words, polite, measured, unnecessary. Then the doctor paused. Not the pause from the day before. This one was heavier, more deliberate. "We need to talk," the doctor said. In person, Elvis closed his eyes. The sentence didn't carry panic. It carried weight. "When?" Elvis asked. "Today," the doctor replied. "As soon as you can." That was enough. They didn't discuss specifics. They didn't need to. The absence of reassurance spoke clearly enough. Elvis hung up and sat there, the phone still warm in his hand. The room looked exactly the same as it had moments earlier. The light filtering through the window hadn't changed. Everything was normal, except him. He stood slowly, every movement deliberate now. He noticed the way his legs felt slightly unsteady, not weak, just aware, as if his body understood something his mind was still catching up to. In the bathroom, he splashed water on his face and looked at his reflection. For the first time since the appointment, fear showed itself openly, not dramatic, not overwhelming, honest. "This is real," he said quietly. He dressed without urgency, choosing clothes that felt comfortable rather than presentable. No costume, no armor, just fabric against skin. The drive to the office felt longer than usual. Elvis watched the city move past a window, noticing details he would normally ignore. The way sunlight hit glass, the way people stood waiting at intersections, unaware of the private moment unfolding inside a stranger's car. He realized then how invisible fear could be. By the time he sat across from the doctor again, Elvis felt strangely steady. The fear had already done its worst in the waiting. What remained was clarity. The doctor didn't waste time. He explained the results carefully, thoroughly, without dramatizing them. There were concerns, patterns, risks that couldn't be dismissed anymore. Nothing final yet, but enough to demand immediate change. Elvis listened without interrupting. For once, he didn't negotiate with reality. When the doctor finished, he asked, "Do you understand?" Elvis nodded. "Yes," he said, and he meant it. This wasn't about a single diagnosis. It was about accumulation. Years of pushing, years of ignoring, years of believing he could outpace consequence. The doctor spoke next about rest, about boundaries, about slowing down, about choices that would no longer be optional. Elvis felt something unexpected then. Relief, not because the news was good, but because it was clear. Clarity meant responsibility, and responsibility, unlike fear, was something he knew how to carry. When the appointment ended, Elvis stood and shook the doctor's hand again. This time, the gesture felt different, less transactional, more human. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. Elvis took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The future hadn't collapsed, but it had narrowed. And for the first time, he understood that narrowing wasn't punishment. It was direction. As he walked toward the car, Elvis accepted something quietly, without ceremony. He could no longer live as if his body were optional. Whatever came next, changes, resistance, frustration, would be faced with attention instead of denial. The day hadn't taken something from him. It had asked something of him. And Elvis knew now that pretending not to hear that request was no longer an option. Elvis didn't speak on the drive home. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't reach for distraction. He let the road stretch out in front of him, long and unremarkable, giving the knowledge space to settle without interference. The doctor's words replayed quietly, not as sentences anymore, but as understanding. Nothing catastrophic had been declared, and yet nothing could go back to the way it was. That was the truth he carried now. When he arrived home, Elvis didn't head inside right away. He stayed in the car, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of stillness. For years, movement had been his answer to discomfort. Keep going, keep scheduling, keep producing. Now, stillness was unavoidable. He stepped inside the house and closed the door behind him, the sound soft but definitive. The rooms looked familiar, unchanged, as if nothing significant had happened. Elvis recognized how deceptive that could be. Change rarely announced itself. It arrived quietly and waited to be acknowledged. He sat down at the table again, the same place where he'd waited the night before, and let his hands rest flat on the surface. He thought about the shows ahead, the commitments that would need renegotiation, the conversations he had delayed for years. None of that felt urgent in this moment. What felt urgent was attention. Elvis realized that the fear he'd carried since the doctor's voice had changed was already evolving. It wasn't panic anymore. It was awareness, sharp, demanding, uncomfortable, but useful. He understood now that he didn't need to be frightened into change. He needed to be honest enough to accept it. The applause would still come. The expectations would still exist. But they could no longer be the measure of his well-being. Elvis walked to the window and looked outside, watching the ordinary movement of the day. Cars passing, people living, time continuing without ceremony. For the first time, that continuity didn't feel like pressure. It felt like permission. permission to slow down, permission to choose differently, permission to treat his body as something worth listening to, not something to be conquered. The knowledge he carried didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a boundary. And boundaries, he realized, weren't limitations. They were guides. Elvis stood there for a long moment, breathing evenly, letting the day unfold without rushing to meet it. He didn't know exactly how the future would change. He didn't need to. What mattered was that he would no longer pretend not to hear the warning signs when they came. The doctor's voice had changed for a reason. Elvis intended to listen, not out of fear, but out of respect for the body that had carried him this far, and for the life that still waited ahead, quieter now, but no less real. That day didn't end with resolution. It ended with responsibility. And for the first time, Elvis felt ready to carry it, not as a burden, but as a choice.